We acknowledge the Ancient Ones, the Greater Shamanic Council of Light, Hermes, both Trismegistus and Seshet, Lady of the Measuring Cord, as above, so below, as within, so without. We acknowledge Imhotep, architect of the cosmos. May the earth be the mirror of heaven. We acknowledge the sacred order of the Magi, and all throughout history who knew, like now, a turning of the ages. We acknowledge the master builders of Göbekli Tepe and the great shining ones at Kalash, the courage and knowledge of the Polynesian wayfinders traversing the great oceans. We acknowledge the prophetic traditions of Ezekiel and Daniel, the traditions of Avalon, the Merlin, and the Round Table, the calendric wizardry of the Maya, and the Venus teachings from Mesoamerica, the Jupiter teachings originating in China, and the Vedic lunar mansion traditions, the Babylonian and Sumerian sidereal zodiacs, the brilliant Hellenistic invention of the seasonal zodiac. The Neolithic peoples around the planet, some still today, honoring the sacred connection between the land and the sky. The Tuatha De Danann in Ireland, who created a time of 2,000 years of peace, the builders of Newgrange. My teachers that are not in human form, Mount Shasta, the Grandfather Rock at the Wonderland of Rocks in Joshua Tree, Mount Haleakala on Maui, the Fish Lake Valley, Hierophany, and the sacred landscapes around the planet, the astrosophy of Rudolf Steiner, and the esoteric astrology of DK in the Tibetan, both presaging the shamanic astrology paradigm, and particularly the archetypal visions of C.G. Jung and the cosmology of my mentor, Dane Rudhyar. For these and more we give thanks.
Daniel Jamario, how in the heavens are you?
Doing quite well. Yes, absolutely great. Here in Metro Manila. That's the only bad news is that I'm in this city. But fortunately, you're going to go back up in the mountains in about 10 days.
Well, the good thing about you being in the city is that we've got this internet connection. I've been really excited to continue this project. We recorded the first episode about Göbekli Tepe and this beautiful ancient temple and old astrology and old astronomy some time ago, and it's just getting released. And now hopefully we're going to have some momentum and some opportunities to meet online like this and further our explorations of shamanic astrology. I think what felt important to me, having edited that Göbekli Tepe video, just knowing that you and I could talk about ancient sites all day long. You've been to so many of them that I'm excited to hear about. I know people are excited to hear about them. But I also want to make sure that we make available your gnosis, your experience, and also your passion for the further exploration of shamanic astrology and these many other branches of the tree as well. And I thought it would be fun.
If the show is called The Further Adventures of Shamanic Astrology, so this show today is like how it started, actually, so that we can now have further adventures.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So how did it start?
Well, I come from a time period of the late 60s. I mean, I guess you could say that everything about myself formed within that cauldron of that cultural renaissance that was happening at that time. And when I was in college, I was a student of philosophy, Eastern philosophy, and Asian history, East Asian studies. And I wasn't into astrology at all, but it turned out that in 1969 came out that paperback version of Rudhyar's book, is the first one that came out.
The Astrology of Personality. Yeah.
Personality, exactly, which was this brilliant synthesis of theosophy Sri Aurobindo, Jungian psychology, and authentic astrology all kind of merged together, and it opened me up. And I said, "Oh, maybe there is something to this astrology thing." And so he was my mentor in the early '70s, and studying with him, studying with his school. I was part of that original group that was at that point called Humanistic Astrology.
Where was that located, Daniel?
Where was it located?
Yes.
Palo Alto, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Although I wasn't living there, I would go out there and travel there. At that time, I was also studying as a meditation teacher. I had kind of left the political revolution behind and wanted to change the world through consciousness. And astrology at that time fit into it because astrology was going through a renaissance of a way of bringing in these more modern sort of Jungian archetypal concepts together with its ancient history in a way that was really impacting young people at that time. But as a meditation teacher, I was also moving in this direction that was way more kind of up and out. Higher consciousness, not connected to the earth, not connected to the body, not connected to our humanity as human, our connection to being a human being. So it was about 1978, 79 that I began going to this thing called the Medicine Wheel Gatherings, which was put together back then by someone named Sun Bear. And the person who would also show up at these medicine wheel gatherings was Joan Halifax, who then became known for starting the Ojai Foundation. And she, at that point, was very much into core shamanism. And so I got really interested in her work and the group of people that she was involved with, more than Sun Bear, actually. And she was doing a vision quest up on Mount Shasta. And so I was actually at a breaking point with my meditation teachers and the path of life I was on, and I was looking for something new. The astrology really wasn't doing it for me, than the form I was using. And I'll go up on Mount Shasta for this vision quest, and all I can say is that during that experience, the mountain came and met me. The land met me. And at that point, I realized that there was something about the night sky that I'd always loved, but I'd never really seen on an experiential level to be part of astrology. And I'm lying out there under the night sky on the land, having gone through an experience of, fasting and being on this vision quest on the mountain. And it hit me. If I'm going to do astrology, I need to weave together my love of the night sky, which I had previously learned twice. When I was a little boy, I learned the night sky, and then also when I was studying to be a TM teacher in Spain, where there was no light in the winter. It was no light pollution. And I learned the night sky because I was really bored with the lectures. So I went out and learned the night sky. And then I forgot it, and there I'm lying on the ground on this vision quest in 1980, 81, in that time frame. And that's when I had, wait a minute, I need to relearn the night sky and make it part of astrology. I didn't really at that point know exactly how it was going to be. But then I left, after that vision quest, I was living in Los Angeles. I was kind of in the last years of my only, quote, real job that I've ever had. I was a computer programmer, actually, back in the early 80s, living in LA. And then I started going out to Joshua Tree because I needed to get out of the city. And so I went out to Joshua Tree, and there was this momentous full moon in January. And it was, I went out there, I think it was January 6th, January 8th, something like that, 1982. And there was this full moon, and I'm out there in this place called the Wonderland of Rocks. And the stone, you're going to see this great picture of the Wonderland of Rocks here. And this was like my first teacher, actually. It was not in human form. And the rock actually spoke to me. And it said, "Come study with me 1 weekend a month for a year." And so I decided to to actually do that. So I went out to Joshua Tree, always at least one full weekend, sometimes 3 or 4 days a month, and I started taking people with me out there, getting people out of LA, putting them on the ground as I researched this new way of doing astrology. And I was getting direct instruction from this rock formation, trying new ways of looking at the chart, doing charts under the sky, putting the horoscope on the sky, seeing the direct connection between the patterns in the sky and the chart, and then also seeing what people's experience was with this format to actually get them out of the city. And it was during those years, in the decade of the 80s, but way before the Shamanic Astrology and Mystery School started, the organization was called the Astrological Vision Quest. I mean, that was the name I was using. And the idea was not like excruciating, hanging by a meat hook or fasting for, days and not eating and no water and all of that. It was more just to get people away from the city, on the ground, experiencing the sky without any interference, in a way separate from their distractions back in the city and from their friends and family, and get them out there on the land and have a direct relationship with the sky. And out of that came the original sort of kernel, the original structure, the original essence of what became the Shamanic Astrology paradigm, which didn't actually get named that until well into the 90s. But that was how it developed in the 1980s.
That's so cool. I've been thinking a lot about this word lately, epiphany, just because of the time around which we are recording this episode. And, one of the definitions is a moment in which you suddenly see or understand something in a new and very clear way. And one of the definitions is when the magi or the magicians came to see this star child, in a way we could say that. Or what about when the stars bring their magic to you? I've heard you speak often, Daniel, and I've heard many recordings of you speak as well. And there's, I wouldn't call it an introduction, but there's an invocation before you speak that calls in many of your teachers. And actually, would you feel comfortable sharing that with us now?
Well, yes. So I always start with the acknowledgement of the ancient ones. And I always like to think of the Greater Shamanic Council of Light, which is an expression that describes the spirituality of shamanism. But I don't want to overemphasize the light part of it, because actually it's bringing light and consciousness into the earth. And it just occurs to me when I always say that expression, the Greater Shamanic Council of Light, that we don't want to make it sound like it's up and out and, something that's like getting off the wheel. This is definitely shamanic. So in addition, then, we always recognize the magi, and you're bringing that imagery out now. In fact, what I was describing about the full moon at Joshua Tree, that was the magi full moon. That's the closest full moon to epiphany, which is that point that traditionally is associated with the astrologers, the magi, following the star at a turning of an age. So then I also love to acknowledge the Merlin, Avalon, and the Round Table, which represents the theme of when the masculine and the feminine would work together as allies, where there wasn't any ranking, and where there's a harmony with the souls and the spirits and the hearts and the minds of men and women, and a desire to create a balanced Gialianic world. So we always talk about that theme, the round table. Even the understanding of the round table was like 12, and then it became 24. And in Shamanic astrology, we actually use 24 archetypes of the masculine and the feminine, 12 doubled. We also acknowledge the calendric wizardry of the Maya. We also tremendously acknowledge and value the ways in which the Egyptian civilization and culture, we could even call it the Egyptian religion, built up this entire view of bringing heaven to earth. that the land and the sky are mirrors of each other. These great building projects that inspired people throughout the ages in all parts of the world. So we acknowledge those folks. We also acknowledge the ways in which the Neolithic peoples throughout history lived their lives in accordance with the sacred connection between the land and the sky, and developed their ceremonies around the way they perceive the seasons and the cycles, the way they perceive the patterns of the sky. We also acknowledge a variety of different essential traditions that come from different parts of the world. We acknowledge the way the Chinese culture understood Jupiter. We acknowledge the way the Mesoamerican culture worked with Venus. We acknowledge the Babylonian sidereal zodiac system. We acknowledge the lunar mansions that come from the Vedic civilization and also from Babylonia. We also acknowledge the way in which the astrosophists have brought in an understanding of working directly with the sky, and we're one of the first groups in modern times that recognized the difference between the tropical and the sidereal zodiac and how it becomes necessary to work with both of them. We also acknowledge some of the traditions and teachings that come from esoteric astrology, from DK, the Tibetan, and the certain things that come from their understanding of the ascendant and the journey of the soul. And then more recently, it's the acknowledgement of Dane Rajar and his cosmology, the acknowledgement of Jung and the archetypes. I'm often reminded of something Jung said, one of my favorite quotes, where he said that if I had another 10 years to live, I would spend virtually all of it learning everything I could about astrology. And then also other streams that have influenced. Now you have become pixelated. Oh no.
I'm more concerned with you, and you seem to be fine. I think I'm getting you fine, so.
Okay. All right. Okay, good. And then this includes things like the transmissions of the great navigators, that the wayfinders of the Polynesians who circled the oceans using the stars. When I think of all the different sources of inspiration, it's like they're from all over the world, going back to the great maritime civilizations that were there around the equator in Sundaland. We'll have a whole other show about that coming up. Anyway, these are the living traditions, and then I acknowledge the teachers that are not in human form. And I was talking about the great stone grandfather rock at Joshua Tree. I'm talking about Mount Shasta herself, and then the various other teachers that have come in and not in human form over the years, including Fish Lake Valley, including the Mimbres River Valley, other places, including the great stone circles. So as the 1980s proceeded, I kept going to more and more of these special places around the world, and one of them that provided me with what is probably the most significant initiation I've had, and actually inspired the creation of shamanic astrology on a much deeper level, was Callanish in the Hebrides, the island of Lewis, where I had the opportunity to go there in 1987 during the lunar standstill. We do intend to have a whole show in the future just on Callanish. I'll be going back there again in September of this year, 2016, for I think my 10th or 11th trip there. But it all started in 1987 by the events that happened there that very much, it influenced me so deeply as to make my whole life about these ways.
And Daniel, are there specific stars that you find are teachers to you more than the others, or is it the whole sky?
I think that my best way to answer that is yes, there are certain stars, but I think that it began with the winter solstice. It was certain things that happened with experiences at the winter solstice that most inspired me early on. And that led me into the original or the initial experience of the awareness of the galactic alignment. It was myself and one other astrologer in the 80s. We were like the only, they were kind of the people crying in the wilderness about the galactic alignment at that point. It hadn't even been named the galactic alignment at that point. But that was all based upon actually working with the winter solstice. And then when I built the stone circle in Faywood Hot Springs later in the 90s, it turned out it was right smack on to the winter solstice point, which is where the hot springs were. So it's actually meant the most to me. I've kind of placed a lot of attention on the winter solstice. But as far as different star groups, I think that if I had to pick one star, it's the one that has been most significant to me personally, which is Spica, which is the star closest to my own rising sun. And as if I've researched the stars in that region of the sky, it represents that area of the sky most connected to what could be called the sacred feminine, the divine feminine, the sacred feminine. Each one of those stars, not just Spica, but the ones that are nearby, Zanaya and Java Java and Vindhya and all have, and Porama. Have a lot to do with the sacred feminine. And then Spica, more than anything else, representing more than any other star in the sky, is kind of as a stand-in for Venus herself as a planet. The mysteries of the feminine going into the underworld, coming out of the underworld. And then in later portions of the cycle of Spica being with the full moon, going all the way back to the time 6,000 years ago, when the full moon was conjunct Spica at Imbolc, at the cross-quarter point in early February. It's no longer there now because of precession.
Right.
But that was the most holy festival for the feminine that was not associated with the underworld journey. Sort of the Sophia radiance of the feminine that would have to do with consciousness and with transpersonal understandings, not death and rebirth, which would be the time when Spica would go into the underworld, which was happening originally in August. So anyway, so the answer to your question is Spica. That's my favorite one.
It's maybe one of our connections, because I was born right at Spica's heliacal rise, or when she came back from the underworld. And
yes.
But Aldebaran's my rising star, or it had just about risen, and I have this deep connection there too. And I love this in consultations of really showing people their sky, or taking people out in the sky and saying hey, look, that's what was rising, or that's where your sun was, and that's a place to get to know and see how Saturn's there right now. When we talk about this Saturn conjunct sun transit, you can tell, because see that star. If you just track Saturn's dance with that star, you'll know this timing. You'll tap into that timing.
And it's virtually impossible without actually spending time with the sky to have even a clue as to how you could integrate the zodiac of constellations and the zodiac of signs. So that a lot of people, the reason they have such a hard time understanding that signs and constellations are something different is because they've never actually spent time with the sky to see how they're actually operating together. So, for example, in my own case, I brought up Spica, which at this time in history happens to be at about 25 Libra, 24 Libra, something like that. But it's actually right smack in the middle of the Virgin Priestess, right smack in the middle of the constellation referred to as Virgo, although we call it the Priestess constellation, following in the footsteps of the Steiner school, which is to actually name the constellations after what it is the more recent culture of the West has been perceiving them as. So the constellation astronomers call Virgo is actually we call the Priestess constellation. And we would find the star, Spica, always right at her girdle, right at her loins, or often seen in representations as holding a shaft of wheat or a shaft of corn, or actually the very same image of that goddess is in Bali as Devi Shri, and she's not holding a corn or wheat, she's holding in the very same part of her body a rice paddy, which is the fact that this imagery is all over the world of this priestess constellation. But my point being is that to be able to have any clue about how to integrate the mysteries of the sign, Virgo, or the constellation, the priestess, and the sign Libra, with the star now being at 24 Libra, you got to hang out with it. Let's just see. Wow, there's Spica, and it's right in the middle of the priestess. But my book says it's Libra, so there must be some kind of cross-pollination, some kind of integration and synthesis happening between the Virgin priestess constellation and what we call the sign of Libra. And this is happening when we're under the sky. We can receive that transmission. That's what we try to get as many people as possible in Shamanic Astrology Mystery School to learn the sky, and then to be able to be willing to participate in this process of synthesizing signs and constellations.
Right, yeah, I mean, it's one of the more confusing things just until you engage with it. And we can say that so much about everything that we learn. I mean, on my side, I'm Gemini rising, but it's the eye of the bull, Aldebaran. And that's why we say it's the eye of the bull and not Taurus, as Daniel is mentioning. Once you get out there and connect to it, it's not difficult. And so we'll hear from the astronomer camp, well, that's why astrologers are wrong. They don't even know precession of the equinoxes has shifted the constellations. But they don't understand, of course, that we're talking about the seasonal archetypes. And Shamanic Astrology then takes it to the next point to bring back the heavens and remerge them. And that's probably for other episodes where we can go deep into that. I don't know that we want to speak so much about precession now, but I do think we want to speak about how has this been done in the past. There's a lot in just kind of the alternative research and people, the archaeoastronomers, and this kind of scene of so much of the information that you and I are called to follow. There's this statement of how can we know where we're going if we don't know our past? And I think this is one of the greatest teachings of Shamanic Astrology to me. I mean, for one thing, it's just been this encouragement to go out and connect to the night sky. Because I study so much astrology, but then it's when I go outside and I watch the sky where I start receiving the information to integrate everything that I'm learning. And it's just in that experience, it's that practice. And it feels to me or I like to dream and believe that that's how it used to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's an element of history, or I would like to say herstory, actually, her story, because unfortunately what we've been what we've learned in school about history only goes back a certain way, and it's all patriarchal, patrilineal, very much influenced by monotheism. And that also has happened in the astrological tradition. A great deal of Western astrology, so-called traditional astrology, is patriarchal, monotheistic, and it's connecting into the general stream of patriarchal culture. You have to kind of go back before to see what it must have been like. So that one of the things we do in Shamanic Astrology is to not just go back to the Greeks, not just go back to Ptolemy, not just to go back even to the Babylonians or the Sumerians, but to take it back even further, back to a time period prior to horoscopic traditions. What I mean by that is prior to the invention of having a horoscope for a person. I mean, actually, a lot of people don't know this, but the word horoscope is not the square or the round wheel. Horoscope means ascendant. So that basically it was the innovation of having a rising sign that brought in this thing to the individual. And that was an evolution, we could say. However, before that, before individual horoscopes, entire tribes, clans, cultures lived in accordance with the patterns of the seasons. They organized their culture around what they saw in the sky, the cosmology. They projected their stories onto the starry patterns, and their culture was guided by that, even if they didn't have individual horoscopes. So now the problem is that at our current time, there's been so much an emphasis on individual horoscopes. We always want to know, what about me? What is my journey? Which is, I'm not saying it's not important, it's important. But what we're trying to do in shamanic astrology is to reintegrate that into a larger context. It's like to reintegrate individual charts into a global understanding of human beings on this planet. Ridjar called it the planetarization of consciousness, about how you can work actually a dialectic from how you have ancient approach to it prior to individual consciousness, and then you have individual consciousness as an antithesis to that, and then it moves toward a synthesis, a grand synthesis, which is the reintegration of the individual story into, well, for example, what we work with synodic cycles, that your own Venus position, your own Mars position, for example, operates within a bigger story, that there's a larger story that the individual is part of. And that goes all the way down up to the level of, well, what larger story are we in the last 2,000 years? Is the larger story shifting into a different story? And who's responsible for the creation of those stories? These are the kinds of things we're looking at.
Just add for people who are listening and might not have heard that term synodic cycle before, I mean, you can really see this very easily in the moon's relationship with the sun. So the moon every month is going to go through all the signs. And we hear this often, well, I'm having my lunar return because my moon is in Gemini and the moon just got to Gemini. But the moon obviously also has its phases, right? Its experience with the sun, its expression of its relationship to the sun. And so I have a Gemini moon, but I also have what's called a disseminating moon. About 4 days after full moon I was born, and of course that happens every month too. And for it to happen in Gemini and to be a disseminating moon, that's only every 19 years, and maybe we don't want to go that far with it right now, but to also say, well, this happens with Venus. And this happens with Mercury and with Mars and to Jupiter, right? And so this is something where also when you're watching the sky, you start to say, well, sure, Venus is in Aries where she was when I was born, but she's now in the night, but she was in the morning when I was born. So when does that all relate? And what are these greater cycles? Like Venus is a 19-month cycle, right, Daniel?
584 days, So that's the 584-day story of Venus during that time frame. And your own Venus position exists somewhere within that story. And it even becomes more precise if it's every 8 years. So it's just, without getting into the details of all of this during this show, we're just using this example about how your own individual story can be seen within a larger story. And that's the part of it that our ancient forebears were working with all the time. So the much longer history of ourselves as human beings on the planet include all of that. It's not just what's happened since the Greeks, or not just what's happened, since the medieval times, or since the invention of science, when science came in and during the Age of Enlightenment. No, we've had the same DNA back at least 200,000 years, and within all of those generations is this relationship with the stars, this relationship with the cycles and seasons, this relationship with our natural world, the fact that we as human beings are part of the creation, not separate from it. And when people ask me often, well, why do you call this shamanic astrology? Well, there's a lot of different reasons for that, but based upon, in this part of our conversation right now, the reason is because all forms of shamanism are about bringing spirit into matter, not about leaving and going off somewhere else. Many theocratic traditions say we need to get off the wheel. We need, and even a lot of early astrology, I mean, like the Neoplatonists, and even in the 16, 17, 1800s, those traditions of astrology were always about, this is the lower plane, and we need to go up and out. We need to go ascend to some other place that's better than where we are here. While shamanism would say, no, we come from spirit. We are spiritual beings, but we're on a journey of involution, down and in. We're bringing spirit into matter. And from the Eastern traditions, there's a well-known person, and he was right there in Rijar's early work, even though Rijar was not shamanic. It's interesting to note that the one guy from India, from the East, that he totally loved was Sri Aurobindo, who was all about bringing spirit into matter. His whole trip was involution, not going up and out. So, I mean, so that is actually in the Rijarian tradition also. Again, even though he himself, as far as I know, wasn't working with the night sky, wasn't, doing shamanic ceremonies and that kind of thing, but he knew his source of inspiration for his type of astrology included this involution journey.
Yeah, and something that comes to mind is this incredibly beautiful painting from 30,000 years ago in the caves of Lascaux with the Pleiades very clearly on the bull's back. And is that someone trying to go out to the Pleiades? And I mean, most of the astronomical papers that I've read about, I'd say, well, no, this is like the heliacal rising of the Pleiades is when back then, that's when you plant, And so there's something about using that guidance of the heavens also to be an earthling. And that's that marriage of the two. And what really comes in, I think, also is in this union of signs and constellations, in this union of the personal horoscope and kind of the global happenings of this marriage of the cosmos and the heavens. This is where we're finding this kind of shamanic stream of awakening to the individuality within the whole on so many different kind of fractals of the micro and the macro.
Yeah, and it also, the other factor here is that when you can perceive the dynamism of how signs and constellations interact with each other, and when you form this relationship with the seasons and the cycles in your body, then you can participate in how archetypes, symbols, images change over time. They're actually not eternal. They're not actually a rigid imagery that is always the same. They're continually evolving and changing all the time. This is one of the great controversies in the archetypal movement, in the archetypal psychology movement. People like Hillman and Jung are perceived of, the way they write it is that these archetypes are eternal symbols in the collective unconscious, when in fact they often are the result of historicity. They're the result of what a culture says to be true about masculine and feminine. And over a period, for example, but over time, they do shift. As the ages turn, as different signs line up with different constellations, you get a change in archetype, which is why Aries is not the same now as it was 2,000 years ago, or the same as it was 4,000 years ago. There's a change in this, and it's part of a great mystery about how this happens. So in shamanic astrology, we question the traditional meanings because they're really not all that useful to people today.
Yeah, and seeing what constellation Aries, seasonal Aries, was aligned to 4,000 years ago versus 4,000 years from now. But what really resonates with me here is this statement of how can we know where we're going if we don't know our past? But it's not about taking the past as the word for the future. It's more about looking at how it was done and incorporating that, revitalizing that into how we do it so we can connect to the great mystery and participate with its evolution moving forward, right?
The reanimation, which I love the word renaissance. Renaissance is not a desire to be an antiquarian. It's not the desire to say, for example, recreate some mythical matriarchy or to go back to the way the Neolithic people did it. None of those things are possible. But by going back to the vitality of these authentic traditions, it re-inspires us. And part of that is, as you put it, is definitely to go back and to have the experience, to actually be with the land and the sky. That's how astrology actually was animated to begin with. And to not just trust in something that was written down in a book or that some authority says this is the way it is. So we have the opportunity to experience these things directly. And it's exciting to be in a position at a time in history when there's more accelerated change. Different time periods in history have greater, what we say, rates of change. I always like to say all the time in readings that there are time periods in history when it's very slowed down, where there's not very much change, that things stay quite static for long periods of time. You could have something like the marriage vow, until death do us part, which could apply to almost everybody, but not anymore. Things process through faster. And even today, we have individuals today that can have more than one lifetime within the context of the same one. There's this rapidity, this acceleration of experiences taking place right now, and that is something that can be inspired by, animated by what has happened in the past. We cannot ignore what has happened in the past. There's a lot of puer types that just wish to, we don't care about history. History is bunk. But if we don't know what we've been before, I just can't understand people not interested in that. You and I have talked about this a lot, that one of my main questions, aside from astrology in research, is who are we and what the hell happened? Because clearly what we see on this planet, there's something that doesn't seem quite right. How did this occur? Why are we not interested in figuring out what it was that happened? I am. So, I'm dedicated to this in combination with assisting individuals in uncovering their story. We certainly believe that every human being has a purpose. In a world that might actually be, on some level, a crapshoot, it's still necessary for a human being to take responsibility for the journey they're on and to come up with a meaning and purpose for their life. And I don't know of anything better than shamanic astrology for assisting a person in finding that out. That's why I've dedicated my life to it.
And then that other piece of how does that soul path, how does that purpose of your life also contribute to the soul path and the purpose of the evolving life of the collective, of the tribe, of the group that's also shown. And as we move forward and ask this question of who the hell are we, and I can't wait to see the episodes that come when we start there, and having this astrology, this web at the root, and bring in these ideas of galactic alignment and the dawning of the age of Aquarius and the precessional shift and these kinds of things, and really connecting to the sky is such a great teacher of that, because clearly we're not at one of these static times right now. And once you start learning the sky and you learn the cycle, you'll find things like, well, the North Star isn't always our North Star. Our current Polaris isn't always the North Star. And there's other stars, like this one was 5,000 years ago, and this one was 12,000 years ago. And in a way, you can lie down and imagine the sky spinning around them and travel into the past or travel into the future. And if you're at a site, that is 4,000 years old, well, what about finding its star and its directions, So Daniel, I think
you and I love that in much the same way. It's like I actually tell my groups often, it's like we can take a journey through time. You can see where the spring equinox was 2,000 years ago, or was 4,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, and if you have enough experience of this. You've done it enough, you love it enough, you know something about what you're looking at, then you actually can make that journey. You're able to actually enter into the space of how it was before and also how it will be in the future by looking at the sky this way. It's like a travel device in many ways.
Yeah, it's a really amazing shamanic journey and almost like a medicine. I often wonder about some of these incredible sites where they arranged for only the light of Sirius or only the Spica on certain dates to come through. Are they actually tapping into just the pure medicine of that one star? And when we visit those sites, they're not going to work that way they used to. But how can we align ourselves to that star? Or how can we align ourselves to again, their directions to really tap into the essence of that place?
Yeah, one example about how the ancients, and even up to this time in history, in certain parts of the world, where they would capture the very specific essence of a cosmological happening, and that would be the zenith tubes, where they would put these tubes down to an altar, like a hole that was dug down to an altar 20 or 30 feet below the surface of the earth. And only on 2 days of the year, when the sun was directly overhead, this can only happen between 23.5 degrees north and south latitude, near the equator, is the sun would hit the altar 20, 30 feet down into the earth, because that's the only time the rays of the sun would hit that point. It's very cool to work with that. In fact, we do that in the Philippines now. We know those dates when the sun is directly overhead. There's a fabulous ceremonial dates. But you can my gosh, there's so many dates you could choose, so many things astronomically you can use to create a ceremony around.
Yeah, and the everydays, like one thing that you've shown me, Daniel, is that a star, at least during the span of a human lifetime, basically rises and reaches the same height in the sky and sets in the same place for your given latitude. And so, like, I have a little ring that catches Sirius every night that it's visible. And It's just a really fun thing to do, to see, wow, there it is. And it's going to be at 3 a.m. at this season, and it's going to be at 1 a.m. at this season. And for these 2 months, you're not going to see it at all, but it's always going to be in that space when it is visible. So that's something that you've shown me. What about for people listening, Daniel? Are there kind of simple exercises or suggestions you could give them just to go out and have fun to connect to the night sky in a way?
I always like to suggest that a person find a spot that, if they're living in the city and they're surrounded by artificial light and high buildings, then you need to find a spot outside of the city. So you create you connect to a place that calls to you, that you can actually get a good horizon. You can have an area of the sky without too much light pollution. Or if you live in a place away from a city, that you have some connection to that land, you can actually then develop a relationship with that piece of land, that space. You could create a little stone circle. You could put certain markers on the land. That's a whole thing beyond the scope of our talk right now about exactly how to build their own stone circle. But you form a relationship on a regular basis with how the sky changes over time. You can start just with the moon. And to be able to get that sense within your body about where the moon is rising and setting, about how that a first quarter moon is always seen at a certain time of day, that the last quarter moon is always seen at a certain time of day. This can be a little stunning to a person who's not done this before. It's like, oh my God, you mean that first quarter moon is always going to be there at that time of day? This is a starting point. And then you have that experience of under a full moon of where the full moon is coming up as the sun is setting, and you get that experience of an opposition. You just form that relationship with it, and then you can add other things. You can add Venus, you can add Mars. You become curious about, well, what am I seeing there? What is that bright star? Is it a star? Is it a planet? You just basically have a curiosity about it, and you learn a few things. Maybe you go online to see where there's different things we can suggest that you form a relationship with. There's the is that I can't think of the name of it right now. I get it every day. The Earth Sky, or the basically the thing that comes through that,
I think
shows
it's
you
earthsky.com.
Oh, really good. It's just some source. Or you buy a magazine, Sky and Telescope, or maybe you could even have a Sky app in order to learn it. But the idea is that you're curious about it, then you form a direct experience over a period of time. Because the sky in March is going to be different than the sky in August. It keeps changing. But then once you tune into it, then you have the sense of regularity about it. Like what you said, it's kind of an advanced thing what you're doing at this point, Brett, but it's still it's no different than what the wayfinders and the navigators, the Polynesian navigators, they knew the arcs of every star, and they had them memorized, and they would know what latitude they were at because they could see the arc of the star, where it came up and where it set. And
yeah,
you can do that
it's kind of an advanced thing that I'm describing. It also is like a little ring hanging in my kitchen. You know what I'm saying? And that's the thing that I would add to this is experience first sometimes can be the coolest way to learn. So you're out there, I mean, even if you are in LA, you're going to see Jupiter and you're going to see Spica and some of these bright stars. And it's like, wow, what is that? And that star really talks to me. And you can get your app out, and I do. And well, what constellation is that? And that's great. But also, well, I'm going to name you Bob, or Susan, and let's have this conversation, and I will devote myself to coming out here and just witnessing you, and maybe you'll witness me, and you'll be surprised then later as your study advances, and you'll find out, oh my gosh, that's my rising star. That star was culminating when I was born, and they call you back, right? And I think they miss in so many ways, not just because the bright city lights have taken them from our view, but because we've just stopped engaging in that wonder.
Yeah, right.
And you'll find your own way to do it.
And as I always like to say here, is that it's really only recently that we've lost this connection. That in the greater herstory of our same people, I mean, the same DNA, the same people back 200,000 years, it's only the last couple of generations that have lost the connection. So it's really only it's in our DNA, it's in our karmic memories to have this connection. It's not that hard to get it back, and I think by not having it, human beings have lost something very significant about what it is to be fully authentic human beings. It's that connection is I think essential. That's, of course, this is no different than other aspects of shamanism. And we also need our connection with animals, also our connection to the plants, and our connection to other aspects of our living world. But as shamanic astrologers, our emphasis is on reconnecting to the starry sky, this huge dimension that we're really missing out on if we don't have a connection to. So our dedication is the restoration of those connections, and we'll discover that they really are familiar to us. They are connected to who we really are, and they're there to be reconnected with. So anyway, we're going to have a lot more of these shows to riff about this stuff. Next show is hopefully going to be the report on the solar eclipse from Soloese. So
yeah, we might even squeeze one in between that if I can get you on the horn, Daniel. So we'll see. So yeah, folks, listen to that from the founder of Shamanic Astrology. You can be a revolutionary in this, and it's not hard to do. There's this illness of starvation happening right now, and we don't have to complain about the city lights taken away from us. Just head out from LA to Joshua Tree or from wherever you are into the wilderness and look up, and you will literally be participating with a revolution to take back what we have always known as human beings on this planet.
Did you just come up with the ultimate Gemini-ism there?
I've been working with starvation for a while, yeah.
Oh my God, so good.
Because we're here to cure it. And it starts with you, people. And I have so much gratitude for Daniel Jamario, who's helped me begin to release myself from that condition, because so much of the greatest stories that I know, they're just sung to me by the stars above, and it's an epiphany every day the sky clears.
Very good. Okay, talk to you next show.
All right, Daniel.
All right.
Be well.